Good morning, Mr. Mybeck. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Chairperson.
Are you ready?
Yes, we are. The next witness is Mr. Siyabonga Mahlangu. Mr. Mahlangu is represented by counsel who's sitting to my right.
Yes. Okay. Will he put himself on record? You can put yourself on record from where you are if you just switch on your mic.
Mr. Marulen, counsel for Mr. Siyabonga Mahlangu on the instructions of Moleka Ratau attorneys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Please administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Siyabonga Mahlangu.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you swear that the evidence will give will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing else but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Mr. Mahlangu, good morning.
Morning, Mr. Mybeck.
Could I ask you please to turn to bundle 1? And if you could turn up page 169.
I'm there.
That, on the face of it, appears to be an affidavit of yours. If I could ask you please to turn to 174. Would you confirm that this is your affidavit and that you signed it under oath on the 25th of August 2020?
That is correct.
And then immediately following that, at page 175, there's a so-called supplementary affidavit of yours. And that affidavit is signed at page 177. Would you confirm that you signed the supplementary affidavit under oath on the 28th of August 2020?
I confirm.
And attached to that supplementary affidavit were two annexures, Annexure SMA1 and SMA2, that you find running from pages 178 through to page 182. Would you confirm those were the two annexures?
I confirm.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask that the affidavit appearing at bundle 1, page commencing at 169, be entered as Exhibit BB 15.2.5.
The affidavit of Mr. Siyabonga Mahlangu, starting at page 169, is admitted as Exhibit BB 15.2.5.
Mr. Chairperson, might I then ask that the affidavit, the supplementary affidavit of Mr. Mahlangu, commencing at bundle 1, page 175, be entered as Exhibit BB 15.2.6.
The supplementary affidavit of Mr. Siyabonga Mahlangu, starting at page 175, is admitted as Exhibit BB 15.2.6.
Thank you, Chairperson. Mr. Mahlangu, as I've explained to you, I intend to lead you through these two affidavits, neither of which are particularly lengthy, and go through the contents. And once I've done that, then I'll have a series of questions for you. If we can start with your first affidavit, you say that you are an adult male non-practicing attorney and the former special advisor to the then Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Gigaba. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And for what period of time did you hold that position?
That would be 1 December 2011 until the end of the last administration, which that administration I think ended somewhere in May 2014.
You go on to explain that you were invited by the Commission to submit an affidavit in response to certain allegations that have been levelled against you by Mr. Mpoma.
That is
You
correct.
deal with the paragraph 3.
That is correct.
And as you say, the essence of those allegations are, and I quote, Mr. Mahlangu called and put pressure on me to finalise the reinstatement of Mr. Gama, accusing me of causing the delay, telling me, number one, wanted to get it done quickly. He furthermore alleged that he scolded me and told me never to call him again. So you were asked to deal with that, correct?
That's correct.
And furthermore, the chairperson requested you to give a full account of what you know about how the settlement between Mr. Gama and Transnet came about, including indicating any person in government at the time or outside of government who, to your knowledge, played a role either directly or indirectly in the reinstatement of Mr. Gama at Transnet or in the conclusion of the settlement agreement on the terms on which it was concluded. In particular, you were requested to indicate whether, to your knowledge, anybody in Cabinet in 2011 played a role directly or indirectly in the reinstatement of Mr. Gama or in the conclusion of the settlement agreement on the terms on which it was concluded, correct?
That's correct.
Then what you do is you have 3 headings before you deal with Mr. Mpoma. The first heading is no knowledge of the contents and details of the settlement negotiations and consequent agreement. Then you deal with persons involved in the settlement discussions. Then you deal with the heading nature of my relationship with Gama at the time. And then at page 172 and further, you deal with the allegations made against you by Mr. Mpoma. You confirm that?
That's correct.
Mr. Maybeck, you know how I was feeling when I couldn't pronounce your junior's surname correctly. Mapoma is Mapoma. Mapoma, yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Chairperson.
M.A. Mapoma. And I think with Mkwanazi, you tended to say Makwanazi. It's Mkwanazi.
Kwanazi without the A.
Mkwanazi. Yes, I feel bad when anybody mispronounces my name, and I feel bad when I pronounce other people's names, but I know that sometimes I struggle myself. So, but I think we all just keep on trying.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Yes, thank you.
So could I then ask you, please, to deal with the text under the heading no knowledge of the contents and details of the settlement negotiations and consequent agreement.
Should I start at paragraph 6? Yes. I was not involved, directly or indirectly, in the settlement discussions leading to the reinstatement of Mr. Gama. The only insight I have on the discussions was when I was informed by Mr. Mkwanazi, the then chairperson of Transnet and acting chief executive officer at the time, that the company intended to reinstate Mr. Gama. Due to the passage of time, I cannot recall the exact reasons for or context of my discussions with Mr. Mkwanazi. He conferred with me on a variety of matters in my capacity as a special advisor to the minister and in his capacity as the chairman of Transnet on things that he needed me to convey to the minister informally or prior to any formal process. I recall that during my conversation with Mr. Mkhwanazi, I advised that it was prudent for Transnet to seek legal advice on the company's proposed course of action. We discussed a few options on eminent labor lawyers that he could consult. One of the names that came up is that of Mr. Sibugule, who at the time was a partner or director at Diners Raids, now Norton Rose. I offered suggestions because of my familiarity with the legal profession. It all remained with the chairman on how he intended to proceed. I do not recall whether the minister was officially briefed by the Transnet Board of Directors on its intention or decision to reinstate Mr. Gama. If this happened, ordinarily there would be correspondence to this effect addressed to the minister. This correspondence would be considered by the department's unit responsible for transport enterprises and one for legal and governance. The Deputy Directors General, who headed these units, would make suitable recommendations to the minister through a decision memorandum. This memorandum would get to the minister via the Office of the Director General. This type of internal correspondence is officially kept and registered by the department's registry.
All right, and then you go on to deal with the persons involved in the settlement discussions, and you record that, save as I state in earlier paragraphs of this affidavit, I have no personal knowledge of the settlement discussions between Mr. Gama and Transnet and the persons who were involved in such discussions, and you say that you only saw the settlement agreement when it was provided to you by the Commission's acting secretary. Is that correct?
I confirm.
And then at paragraph 10, you state that, save as stated in this affidavit, I do not know any person in government at the time or outside government who played a role, either directly or indirectly, in the reinstatement of Mr. Gama at Transnet or in the conclusion of the settlement agreement. You say, in particular, I do not know of anybody in cabinet in 2011 who played a role, directly or indirectly, in the reinstatement of Mr. Gama or in the conclusion of the settlement agreement on the terms on which it was concluded.
I confirm.
And then you go on to deal with the nature of your relationship with Mr. Gama at the time, and you state that you commenced work as a special advisor in December 2010. The settlement agreement with Mr. Gama, you say, was concluded on the 22nd of February 2011, and you state that by this time I was familiarizing myself with my work environment. You had not met Mr. Gama or engaged with issues pertaining to his employment or dismissal. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you say, prior to joining government, I had not had any dealings with Mr. Gama, whether professionally or socially.
That is correct.
And then, for the balance of the affidavit, you deal in the main with the allegations made against you by Mr. Mpoma. Do you want to deal with those paragraphs, please?
Thank you, Mr. Maybeck. I'll do so. Mapoma's allegations are contained in paragraphs 26 to 7 of his affidavit. Principally, he alleges that, 1, I pressured him to expedite Mr. Gama's reinstatement. 2, he scolded me for doing so and advised me never to call him again. 3, he only knew me professionally. Given that at the time I was still new in my job, I could not have pressured Mapoma. I had no reason or motive to pressure Mapoma or anyone. In any event, my role or function did not involve pressuring officials. Furthermore, my disposition towards Mapoma and its complementary social network would not permit me to act rudely towards him or pressure him in the manner that he alleges. I was taken by surprise to learn of these allegations. First, Mapoma's recount of the nature of the relationship that existed between us is not entirely correct. During my time as partner at Mahlangu Nkomo Mabandla Rachimbilani Attorneys, MNMR, I interacted with Mapoma frequently and developed a professional relationship that was based on mutual respect. I would seek his counsel on how our firm could increase its flow of work from Transnet. He gave me good advice and was favorably disposed towards me. This type of professional proximity continued even after our firm merged into Edward Nathan Sonnenberg's. Secondly, we had a common social circle. In his affidavit, Mapoma underplays this social circle and its effect on how I would view him. This circle consisted of friends predominantly from Umtata and surrounding areas. Some of these friends were attorneys. I developed a strong bond with them. Some of them I know from as early as 1999. Mapoma socialized with this social circle. I may not remember the specific events, but I do recall meeting him at some of the social gatherings where I was invited. In this social circle, Mapoma was regarded as one of the elder brothers and was accorded commensurate respect. I also treated him with the respect I reserve for my older siblings. I was introduced to this social circle by a friend who then worked as a legal advisor for a client of Weber Wenzel, where I did my articles. Our friendship grew and persists to this day. Mapoma errs in his affidavit that I went to university with any of the friends in the social circle. I submit that the support Mapoma gave to MNMR, the intersection between one of our social circles, and the nature of my social interaction with him forbade me from being rude to him or putting any pressure on him. This would have resulted in backlash in an important friendship circle and would have adversely affected my standing as an attorney amongst the community of lawyers in that social circle. I care about my reputation and standing amongst my friends and peers. Thirdly, I had no motive or reason to pressure or call Mapoma about the pace or details of the settlement between Mr. Gama and Transnet. Lastly, if I had any questions, which I did not, I would have raised these with Mr. Mkhwanazi. To the best of my recollection, Mapoma was a few levels down in the Transnet executive management hierarchy, which meant that I would not encounter him in the normal course of my duties as special advisor to the minister. I have never said to Mapoma, as he alleges, number one, wanted to get it done quickly. In the South African political lexicon, the term number one is usually used to refer to a sitting president of the Republic. I assume that in his allegation, Mapoma ascribes the same meaning to this term. If that is so, Mapoma's allegation is without basis. in my normal use of language, I do not refer to a sitting president as number one. In particular, I have not referred to former President Zuma as number one. In my ordinary use of language, or I have not referred to former President Zuma as number one in my ordinary use of language. Pardon me for the typo. What comes naturally to me in my conversations is to refer to President Zuma using his initials, surname, or clan names. For avoidance of doubt, I wish to state that I have never used former President Zuma's name as alleged by Mapoma. I have never met or had conversations of any substance with President Zuma other than in large government gatherings. He has never instructed or requested me to put pressure on anyone to finalize the reinstatement of Mr. Gigaba. Furthermore, my erstwhile principal has never instructed me to put pressure or follow up with anyone regarding the reinstatement of Mr. Gigaba. At no point did the minister advise me that the president wished to have Mr. Gigaba reinstated expeditiously or that the dispute with him be resolved expeditiously. All I recall is that after the board had decided to reinstate Mr. Gigaba, but prior to him resuming his duties at Transnet, the minister requested a meeting with him. I was not part of this meeting. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right. Could we then please go to your supplementary affidavit? Your supplementary affidavit we see was signed 3 days after your initial affidavit, correct?
That is correct.
And in your supplementary affidavit, you effectively repeat the first 4 paragraphs of your first affidavit. We needn't go through that. Perhaps I can ask you, please, to pick up at paragraph 5 and deal with the next 1 1/3 or 1.5 pages.
Thank you. After I submitted the affidavit to the Commission, I discovered 2 emails in my personal email. One dated 18 January 2011, Annexure SMA1, here too, and the other 4 February 2011, Annexure SMA2, which are relevant to what I was required to answer in my main affidavit. These emails refer, albeit briefly, to the settlement negotiations between Mr. Gigaba and Transnet. I came upon the 2 emails in my personal email box in the course of my preparation of a separate affidavit that I have been invited by the Commission to submit and which relates to my employment at the Department of Public Enterprises and my role in the events identified by the Commission. Their omission in my affidavit of 25 August 2020 was not deliberate. The 2 emails are from me to then Minister of Public Enterprises, Mr. Malusi Gigaba. I did not remember the communication to Minister Gigaba as recorded in, I did not remember the communication to Minister Gigaba as recorded in the email and still do not have an independent recollection of it. Although in Annexure SMA1, I promised the minister that I would obtain the settlement agreement for him and to brief him on it. I did not do so, and in fact, saw the settlement agreement for the first time when it was provided to me by the Commission. In SMA 1, I also advised the Minister to brief the President about Transnet's intended settlement with Mr. Gama. I do not remember the reasons why I advised the Minister to do so, but in hindsight, I think that it was probably because of the public interest that the matter had invoked at the time. I think the word was supposed to be evoked. I can think of no reason. I have no knowledge whether Minister Gigaba discussed the matter with President Zuma. In SMA 2, I set out my advice to the Minister on matters that Mr. Mafika Mkonazi, the then chairperson of Transnet, wished to convey to him through me. I do not recall me and Mr. Mkonazi discussing the terms of the settlement with Gama in any detail, and in fact have no independent recollection of the discussions with him that preceded my email to the Minister. In my main affidavit, I state that in January 2011, I would not have been involved with the settlement discussions because at the time, I was newly employed as the Minister's special advisor. SMA 1 and SMA 2 show that I had had meetings or discussions with Mr. Mkwanazi around 18 January 2011, about 2 weeks after the Christmas break, and around 4 February 2020. These emails are the only reminder to me that I held discussions with Mr. Mkwanazi and the Minister separately before the settlement was concluded. I had no recollection of any other discussion with Mr. Mkwanazi or the Minister. I reiterate that I was new in my job and could not have been involved in the settlement discussions in any substantive way. Any discussion with Mr. Mkwanazi on the dispute between Mr. Gama and Transnet was intended for me to convey to the Minister Transnet's position on the matter. Should I come across any documentation or correspondence that may be of assistance to the Commission, I will submit it at the earliest opportunity.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, Chair. I'm so sorry for interrupting. I see the date 4 February 2020.
Sorry?
I see the date 4 February 2020. That is paragraph 9 of Mr. Mahlangu's affidavit. Could you...
Oh, yeah, that must be
Yes.
2011. Yes,
2012,
2011.
2011, yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
And then, Mr. Mahlangu, do you want to deal at all with these two annexures? If you go to page 178, annexure SMA 1, the only part of that annexure email that deals with Mr. Gama is the second bullet point. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And it reads, I understand that Transnet may be nearing a settlement with Mr. Gama. I'll obtain the details of the settlement and brief you accordingly. I suggest that you socialize the President and his key aides, in brackets, formal and informal, close brackets, on the proposed settlement. It is intended that the forthcoming board should consider and authorize it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then annexure SMA 2, first annexure was an email sent on the 18th of January. The second one, SMA 2, is an email sent on the 4th of February. Now, I would just ask you to confirm this email is a lengthier document, certainly in relation to Mr. Gama, but it deals with two things. That is the settlement with Mr. Gama and also the issue that arose about Mr. Gama wanting to apply for the then vacant position of Group Chief Executive of Transnet. Is that correct?
That is correct. I consider the two matters intertwined and
Yes.
interlinked.
And you, as you say, you consider them intertwined, you deal with them on that basis in the email, and you presented the minister with what you consider to be various options. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you wish to highlight any particular aspect of the advice that you gave the minister?
I would love to, Mr. Maibek. Should I just read it into the record?
Well, you can if you wish, otherwise you could just summarize what you consider to be important.
I think the chairperson, with your leave, I would like to read it all into the record because it discloses my state of mind and what
That's
I
fine.
thought of at the time.
You can read it.
Dear Minister,
You're starting with the one of 18 January?
no, the 4th, the 18th
Oh,
January.
4th,
The
okay.
4th, yes.
Yes, continue.
Dear Minister, at my meeting with Chair, he acknowledged that advertising the GCE position was a mistake. In light of Gama's response to the advert, the board seeks guidance on the way forward. Despite the ongoing without prejudice discussions, G insists on staying on the list. He was informed through his lawyer of an offer to reinstate him with no loss of benefits and a contribution towards his legal costs. It is my recommendation that the issue regarding his discipline and the appointment of the GCE be dealt with separately. His challenge to his dismissal should not delay the appointment of the new GCE. In light of the current impasse on the case regarding his dismissal, the board should go ahead and deal with the appointment of the GCE. The following options seem to present themselves. 1, the board should not interview G, but proceed to make a recommendation on the available candidates. The board may base its view on the quality of CVs that it received. G may challenge the appointment of the new GCE as flawed, arguing that he's entitled to be heard by the committee because he was previously shortlisted. I am persuaded that the foregoing argument is not likely to sway a court to come to G's aid, but it is likely to require political management. 2, the board should interview him and not shortlist him for consideration by the minister. The risks highlighted in one above equally apply. 3, the board should interview him and shortlist him for consideration by the minister. The minister may proceed and appoint his choice. It is still likely that G will challenge the process and allege that the appointed candidate was a fait accompli. This may attract unnecessary attention to the minister. The minister should avoid being a bearer of bad news. In my view, there is a need to contain the drama at Transnet level. In either scenario, it is likely that G will sue. He has no right to be appointed GCE, and therefore any likelihood of an urgent interdict succeeding is very minimal. I further recommend that G should not be interviewed or shortlisted. In that way, the minister does not have to deal with him. A Transnet Act in this regard will constitute a valid act in law upon which the minister may base his action. Should he wish to interdict the minister, he will have to show that the minister will infringe one of his legally recognized rights. In order to succeed in that argument, he will have to show that he has prospects of success in overturning the recommendation to the minister. In light of the facts and circumstances surrounding G's case, it is not likely that a court will uphold such proposition. Further, there is a great likelihood that the leaks of the case between him and Transnet emanate from his side. If such speculation holds, his interviews and shortlisting will arise publicity that is unnecessary and may result in unintended political statements. The matter surrounding his dismissal may be dealt with by the GCE and the board going forward. It seems unavoidable that he may sue, but it is a lawsuit I think we should be prepared for and we should defend. I await your guidance. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mahlangu. That then completes your two affidavits. Perhaps I could start my questioning by dealing with the need for the supplementary affidavit that arose. You've confirmed that you were asked to give a full account of what you know about how the settlement agreement came about, correct?
That's correct.
And we know that that request was separate from the request for you to deal with Mr. Mphoma's allegations.
That is correct.
If you look at your first affidavit, if I could invite you please to go to page 169.
Page
169.
16?
169.
Yes, sir.
Turn to page 170. Now, what we know is you deal with Mr. Mphoma from page 172 onwards. I just want to point out to you that in your first affidavit, the only thing that you say that you knew about potential settlement is your initial discussion with Mr. Mkonazi. Correct?
That is correct.
I mean, as for the rest of your affidavit, it just says that you were placed under no pressure, you don't know of the involvement of anyone else. So your knowledge in this affidavit is limited to the initial discussion with Mr. Mkonazi. Correct?
That's correct.
Your recollection of that discussion, though, appears quite detailed. If we go to the text of paragraph 6, you say that you were informed by Mr. Mkonazi that the company intended to reinstate Mr. Gama. You remember that?
Yes, I remember the text. Like I said, I'm dependent on the text.
Yeah. And then what you do is you go on to explain what happened after he told you that. You say, I can't recall the exact reason or the context of my discussion. And you go on to say, I recall that during my discussion, presumably that's your discussion referred to in paragraph 6, correct? Mr. Mahlangu?
Yes, I'm trying to follow paragraph 6. Yes, sir.
I recall that during my conversation with Mkonazi, I advised that it was prudent for Transnet to seek legal advice. And you discussed a few options of eminent labor lawyers. The proposal of Mr. Gule came up. So you remember that initial discussion and the advice that you gave about Mr. Gule.
Yes.
So what you failed to mention in your first affidavit, you don't mention that you had other discussions with Mr. Mkonazi about Mr. Gama, correct?
I failed, yes.
Nor do you mention that based on those other discussions, you then interacted with and advised the minister about the Gama issue. You didn't mention that either.
That at that time when I drafted the affidavit,
Yes.
that I did not recall.
Yes. But your answer to my question is you accept you didn't mention it. You limited your knowledge to paragraph 6 and 7.
Yes.
And you accept that in relation to the first and initial discussion, you have a relatively detailed recall of it.
Mr. Maybeck, I think what needs to be clear, I don't know if it was one discussion.
Yeah.
It's a long time ago, but there's salient features of it that I recall.
see.
So I wouldn't want us to stick to a meeting. It could have been 1, 2, or 3. I spoke to Mr. Mkonazi often, but what I mentioned about that discussion is what I could recall as I was answering this affidavit.
When you read your affidavit, you'll see that you're referring to one discussion.
It's probably, yes, I probably referred to one discussion,
Yeah.
but as I say to you, I recall, as I actually preface in my affidavit,
Yeah.
that some of these things I won't recall, the sequence may be a bit tricky,
Yes.
but I recall the essence, Mr. Moore.
I understand that. You recall the essence, it seems, of your initial discussion with Mr. Mkonazi.
Of the discussions.
Yeah. So let's go back to the fact that you also don't mention then in the first affidavit that based on those discussions with Mr. Mkonazi, you then interacted with the minister and advised the minister in relation to them. You didn't mention that.
I didn't.
Then what we see in your supplementary affidavit is that you put up 2 emails which show that you had further interaction with Mr. Mkonazi and that you advised the minister accordingly. But what's important is that in your supplementary affidavit, you seem to state that you have no independent recollection of the events in those emails or of the emails. Is that correct?
That's correct. Insofar as you read the 2 affidavits together, Mr. Mayor.
Let us go to, so just let me, so that everyone's clear. When a situation like this arises, I suppose there's one of 2 things that a person can do. The one is you can say, I've come across these emails, I didn't attach them to my first affidavit, I'm sorry. They've now triggered my memory, they've refreshed my memory, and now I remember what happened, and this is what happened. Or you could adopt the position which you seem to, and that is, well, I came across these emails. I don't have any independent recollection of these emails or of the events that are dealt with in them. But I accept that they're my emails, and I accept that if that's what's recorded, I must have had the discussion. Is that right?
That's the second option, is that's my situation.
Yeah. But you confirm that, so your evidence, because this is important, your evidence now before the commission is, yes, here are the 2 emails, but I have no independent recollection of writing those emails, of sending those emails, or of the content of the email.
That is correct, Mr. Mayor.
All right. And perhaps I can just show you where you say that, because
You're sure that is the position, Mr. Mahlangu?
That is correct, Chair. And when I discovered the emails, I immediately contacted the commission, and I also contacted my senior counsel, because I was preparing for a different affidavit, and then I came across this. And I don't know if that's all of it, but that's as far as I can recall. And I wouldn't have omitted them had I seen them in the first email. Okay. And the memory they jog is consistent with what I've said in the main affidavit.
Okay.
all right, well, we'll come to the significance of that in a moment. So I needn't take you to the various passages where you say that. You accept that your version is, I have no independent recollection of writing the email, sending the email, or of the contents of the email.
That's correct.
And then I suppose what you must accept, if we go to page 171, paragraph 11, is where you say in the 3rd line, by this time, and now you're talking about the time of the settlement, I was still familiarizing myself with my new work environment. I'd not met Mr. Gama or engaged with issues pertaining to his employment or dismissal. Well, you must accept then, albeit that you have no independent recollection, but on the face of the 2 emails that you've put up, that statement is false, correct?
Yes.
In fact, what the emails show, albeit that you have no independent recollection, is that you had had a series of discussions with Mr. Mkhwanazi. You had reported on those discussions to your boss, and in fact, you had given your boss advice in relation to them. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in fact, you say you remember none of this, but in relation to the Gama settlement, you had actually advised Minister Gigaba that he should socialize the president, correct?
Not on the details, but on Transnet's proposed course of action.
Yeah. So just so we understand, are you now remembering this, or are you just saying what you
Based on the document.
Yes. You told the president, and we're going to come to the detail, but you advised the minister. You said your advice to him was, I suggest you socialize the president, correct?
That's correct.
You have no recollection of that. And then what you did just
And
now...
maybe, I'm sorry, Mr. Maybach, before we get further, what did it mean to say the minister should socialize the president?
To make him aware.
I've got an idea, but I want to hear it from you.
To make him aware of what Transnet is about to do.
That is reinstate Mr. Gama.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
We're going to come back to the advice that you gave, but I'm just testing this. You have no independent recollection. And then, in relation, as you say, the second email reflects there were two things. There was the Gama settlement, and there was the issue of him wanting to be a candidate for a promotion. And you then advised the minister, and you've read that email in some detail about the various options, correct?
That's correct.
And you have no independent recollection of that?
No.
But you have a recollection...
I've got some triggers, as I said.
Well, that's what you say in your affidavit.
No, I think you're interpreting it very narrowly.
Yes.
To the extent that is there in the thing, I remember.
Yes, fair enough.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
But I don't have other things that I've been thinking long and hard about.
Yes, fair enough.
I've been trying to remember it.
But Mr. Mahlangu, I'm going to just put to you what you've now agreed to twice before. You have no independent recollection of writing the email or sending the email or of the contents of it, but you accept that if that's what you wrote, well, then it happened. That's essentially what you say.
Yes.
But you have no independent recollection of any of that happening.
I think that would be too strong. I think when I say I have no independent, I'm saying I don't have command of the full facts.
Well, in your affidavit, you say you have no independent recollection.
There's no inconsistency with that,
All
Mr.
right.
Maybach.
Fair enough. But you somehow have a very clear recollection of your first discussion with Mr. Mkhwanazi, correct?
Like I said, I don't know if it's the first, Mr. Maybach. There was a discussion where he told me something and I said, go and get legal advice. There is a discussion like that.
And we're going to come to that because we know that that must have been at the outset. So in fairness to you, we'll come to the date line and timeline. So that will, but what you do have a very clear recollection about, if I understand, is that you didn't phone Mr. Mpuma.
I think I need to get to that. If we're discussing Mapoma, my recollection, here is it. I don't recall making a phone call, a physical phone call, right? I knew Mr. Mapoma, and he knew me, right? So what I deny is that I made a phone call to pressure Mr. Mapoma.
And you somehow have a very clear recollection of that.
I have a very clear recollection because that is something, it's a life event.
But-
Because Mr. Mapoma was very important to me at the time in my circle and my being.
Yes.
So if I have any tension with him, I would remember it.
All right. And I presume that when you were carrying out your duties as a special advisor to Mr. Gigaba, you would also remember them.
I'm talking
Is that
about
correct?
not all of them.
I see. And these ones you simply can't remember.
Mr. Mapoma is a specific instance.
Yes.
Like I am saying, till to this day,
Yes.
I battle to understand why Mr. Mapoma would say that about me. And like I say to you, I had no motive, no intention. And that I could not have picked up the call for the intention of pressuring Mr.
Mr.
Mapoma.
Mahlangu, you, I think, misunderstand what I'm driving at. We're going to come to your version about Mr. Mpoma. But essentially what you've said is you have a very clear recollection of not having called him. that right? And pressurized him.
I recall that I did not pressurize Mr.
Just so that
Mapoma.
you understand, to this very day, Mr. Mapoma also can't understand why you deny having had that discussion with him.
I'm telling you that it would not have happened.
right. Well, we'll come
It's
to
it's improbable.
I'm going to suggest to you that it's highly probable, but in order to get to that, we need to look at the chronology. So let us start off then with the dismissal of Barbara Hogan as the Minister of Public Enterprises. Now, as I understand it, you have a doctorate in political science, is that correct?
That's incorrect.
What doctorate do you have?
Administrative law.
And as I understand it, you are someone who follows politics and in fact decided that you wanted to pursue a career for a point in time in that field. Is that right?
Vaguely, yes.
Sorry?
Vaguely, yes.
All right. Now, let me just summarize for you the evidence of Mrs. Hogan. She says that at the time that Mr. Gama was facing disciplinary action in 2009, and we know that he was suspended on the 1st of September 2009, she approached former President Zuma to confirm the board nomination of a Mr. Maseko as the new Transnet chief executive. You've heard of this testimony, presumably.
No, I wasn't following it.
All right. And he wanted Mr. Gama to be appointed, and he refused to make any board appointments pending the outcome of Mr. Gama's disciplinary inquiry. You've not heard of that either.
I have no knowledge of that.
But I mean,
All I know
yes.
is that the position of GCE became vacant when Ms. Maria Ramos left,
Yes.
up until.
And what we do know, and I'm surprised you say you don't know anything about this, because what we do know around about this time, there was much political support for Mr. Gama that was played out in the press. Do you not remember that?
That I do remember.
Yes.
I don't remember the detail of Ms. Hogan's testimony,
Fair
and I
enough.
don't remember how she dealt with it. What I recall is that there was a lot of drama
Yes.
surrounding Mr. Gama.
And there was a lot of political support for him. I can take you to the portions in the record if necessary, but there were certain politicians that came out in his favor. There were trade unions that came out in his favor. And Mr. Malema also came out in his favor.
I accept that.
All right. Then, after Mr. Gama was dismissed at the end of June of 2010, so a year or so later, Mrs. Hogan then approached former President Zuma about the appointment of a new board. And she made that approach, according to her evidence, in August, September, only to then be relieved of her position with effect from the 31st of October 2010. You would have no doubt followed that in the media.
I followed the reshuffle, but I didn't follow specifically Ms. Hogan.
Yes, but your boss then ended up replacing her the next day.
Yes,
Yes,
but
it's not something that you weren't aware of.
it's not my boss at the time.
Yes.
Remember at that time, I was practicing law.
All right.
So I did not follow specifically what was happening at public enterprises. I'll follow the news like everybody else.
Yeah.
Chair, I beg your pardon, and I'm sorry to Mr. Myberg for interrupting, but I think Mr. Mahlangu has said that he hasn't seen the evidence of Ms. Hogan, and I don't know if he can speak to it.
You have
Alternatively,
lowered
it could
your
be put
voice. I can't hear you.
I beg your pardon, Chair. Chair, Mr. Mahlangu has repeatedly said that he hasn't seen the evidence of Ms. Hogan, and questions are being put to him from that evidence.
Yes, but he was being asked whether he became aware of that from the media, I think. I think he said he was aware but not of details because he was not in the Department of Public Enterprises at the time. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
So what we know is that Mrs. Hogan was relieved of her position on the 31st of October 2010. You might have read about that in the press. I'm not trying to pin you to the date, but you recall having read about that.
It wasn't just Ms. Hogan. There was a whole shopping list
Yes, absolutely.
of reshuffle. So I wouldn't
Now-
have specifically known what reasons and what's not. There
What
were-
we know is that Mr. Gigaba was then appointed as the new minister with effect from the 1st of November 2010.
Correct.
So he replaced Mrs. Hogan.
Correct.
And a new board was then appointed by him, and that board took up its duties in December of 2010.
That is correct. It was the same time as I arrived.
And then we know that Mr. Gama was reinstated towards the end of February, a few months later.
That is correct.
And we know that a few years later, he was then ultimately promoted to the position of Group Chief Executive of Transnet.
That is correct.
Now, do I understand you to be saying that, or what part of this controversy, some of it was played out in the press, were you aware of before you took up your position as Special Advisor on the 1st of December?
I can't recall specifics, but I know that there was something about Gama being in the news. What I can help you with is why did I consider it a drama?
All right. Well, why did you consider it a drama?
At that time, this is the opinion I held, which is why I'm telling you that it was improbable that I would pressure anyone. At that time, when I got to have some conversations with the minister and Mr. Mkwanazi, what I remember is that there was an insistence on Mr. Gama to be appointed GCEO, right? And that any disciplinary proceedings against him and the finding and all of that were in some way orchestrated to stop him from being so. And so for me, Transnet is a very big organization, an important one for this country. And you wouldn't want to have a person, because invariably, in my view, I may have been wrong, but my view was that if there is that, then there's probably divisions, Chair, within Transnet. And that also, if there is a finding by an independent committee, so all of those things, it was a combination of complex political issues and legal issues. And therefore, in my view, Minister had to tread carefully around that. And based on SMA 2, I believe that I probably would have said as much to him. And I really do remember that I was a bit cautious around the issues relating to Mr. Gam because of that. And I may not at the time have had full details and so on, but I remember that it was a politically charged matter, it was a legally complex matter.
Politically charged and legally complex. No doubt an important thing on the minister's radar, correct?
I don't know if it was the only thing, and I don't know if
I
it
never
was
said it was the only thing. I said it, no doubt, an important thing on the minister's radar.
No.
I see. Well,
No.
you've sent him emails, Mr. Mahlangu, that deals with this. One of your emails is 1.5 pages where you list, I think, 4 or 5 different options. I mean, it was a significant event.
It was
something that needed to be dealt with.
It was a drama he shouldn't attract.
Well, there we
It
go.
wasn't his place.
All right.
It wasn't his place, because my view was if he gets himself in it, he won't be able to get himself out of it.
All right. Well, let's deal with that. So what we're actually dealing with is what you knew before you took up your position. So, Mr. Gigaba.
I'm sorry, just clarify that, Mr. Mahlangu. What you have explained, was that something you knew before you took up your position as special advisor? Or was it something you knew after you had taken up your
It is
position?
after, Chair. I had no specific interest in public enterprises when I was an attorney.
It was after you had
It
taken
was
the
after,
position?
Chair. And Chair, I think the timing that the commission needs to be aware of is that I arrive on the 1st of December. 1st of December in government, then things slowed down. And at that time, they were orientating the minister with some things. There were a lot of briefings that minister was going through. January, Chair, what happens in the political calendar is that you have what is called the January 8 in the ANC. So the political leaders are consumed by the activities leading up to the January 8. Then from the January 8, Chair, you have the Makotlas. So you have the ANC Lekotla, where the ANC National Executive Committee member, of which my minister was, would take place. Then you have the Cabinet Lekotla. You actually have access to the minister after the State of the Nation address, which would take you to around first or second week of February. I'm not saying the administration is at a standstill, but I'm saying that have that in mind as you assess what I knew.
We're going to come to that very chronology, Mr. Mahlangu. So, Minister Gigaba is appointed with effect from the 1st of November. Mr. Mkunazi gives evidence of a meeting that he had with the minister. He says that meeting happened in October, but at the same time his evidence was when he met with Mr. Gigaba, it was as if he was already the minister. So, October, November. And I want to just take you to bundle 4A. I just want to run through with you what was then discussed between Minister Gigaba and Mr. Kwanazi.
Bundle 4A.
Bundle 4A, could I ask you to turn to page 4?
I'm on page 4.
So, at paragraph 4.3, Mr. Mkonazi says, in my meeting with the minister, he indicated that he was not happy about a few things. First point, a lack of transformation, as there were very few senior positions held by African women. The next point, he was under the impression that the procurement system of Transnet was open to corruption by employees and other stakeholders. He emphasized that as the incoming chair of the board, this must be an area of focus. The next point, he was somehow aware of problems in the procurement of suppliers and services for mega projects in Transnet, and then he lists a whole lot of them. The fourth point, he was also under the impression that disciplinary matters at Transnet were racially biased, and that there was a condonation process at Transnet that was generally used to deal with deviations within Transnet. Now, Mr. Mkonazi put up then, I think you mentioned this to me before we began, you're aware of the fact that Mr. Mkonazi then put up a supplementary affidavit. And what he says is that at this meeting, Minister Gigaba also requested.
Do you want to remind me where the
Yes,
supplementary
Could you,
affidavit is?
perhaps I could ask you, Mr. Mahlangu, to turn now. The easiest way is to ask you to look at the third last tab, Chairperson, in bundle 4A.
BB 2D 20 or something.
19.
19.
And then to turn backwards to page 21.415. So 414 is the supplementary affidavit. And I want to direct your attention, please, to paragraph 5. I've mentioned in the initial affidavit, in paragraph 4.3, that's the meeting we're dealing with, that I had a meeting with the minister, at which the minister highlighted things that he was not happy with at Transnet. In this meeting, Minister Gigaba also requested that the incoming board must also review the fairness of the dismissal of Mr. Gama. You see that?
Yes, I can.
Now, you have told the chairperson that you were appointed as special advisor with effect from the 1st of December 2010.
That's correct.
Were you then briefed by the minister?
Not in the once-off briefing sessions. We interacted in the office. The minister had ways to talk to us either as advisors or as the entire political office on issues.
Yes, well, were you informed by the minister about the concerns that he had at Transnet?
No,
Were you told by the minister of the discussion that he had had with Mr. Mkonazi?
no,
Were you told by the minister that he had requested that Transnet should review the fairness of the dismissal of Mr. Gama?
no,
In fact, Mr. Mkonazi says that the minister issued what was tantamount to a shareholder instruction, instructed him to review the dismissal of Gama.
I wasn't there in 20.
No,
in
I'm not asking
October.
you that. I'm asking you, did the minister tell you about this?
No,
You would accept that the minister seemed to have very serious concerns about Transnet.
I'm trying to go back in time. So I don't know if I learned of the Gamma issue from the office. What I know is that Mr. Mkwanazi appraised me of it for the purposes of informing the minister. It would therefore be on the basis of my report to the minister that the issue about Mr. Gama would have been discussed.
Yes. We're going to come to that, but just so that I understand your evidence, you say that the minister didn't brief you about his concerns about Transnet, and the minister himself never told you that he had issued an instruction that the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal should be reviewed.
No, on the issues with Transnet, the department has a unit responsible for transport enterprises. And I recall at the time there were issues that were ongoing, but there were no specific issues that sprang to mind. As I know that the NMPP, as now I see it from Mr. Mkwanazi's affidavit,
All right.
the department was grappling with it.
Yes,
But I don't recall specific instructions to me. In fact, the minister never instructed me.
well, perhaps you could just say that and we can live with it.
Yeah, the minister
Right.
never instructed me.
Yes, let's move on then.
Did Mr. Mkwanazi tell you that the minister had instructed the board to review the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal
No,
in the discussions he had with you?
no, Chair, not specifically. I think my memory is not good. But remember, Mkwanazi tells me what is happening on the
Yes.
issue.
Yes.
So we didn't start, and I arrived on the 1st of, these discussions happened in January. So I suppose a lot has happened between October and January. Because then when he tells me things, he's telling me things that are happening there that I relate to the minister.
But he could have said to you when he started interacting with you in your capacity as special advisor to the minister, you know, we are busy with reviewing the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal. I had a meeting with the minister in October and he instructed the board to review the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal. One would imagine that he might not have just started telling you what was happening at the time, but he might tell you the background, namely, if they were busy with a review of the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal, and if that review had been instructed, they had been instructed by the minister to conduct it, one would expect that that's where he would have started when talking to you, so that as he continued to interact with you thereafter, you would have the background and the context.
Chair, I cannot remember that.
You cannot remember?
No. But what I remember is the discussion specifically, where they emanated and what the genesis were. No. It's possible, if he did, it's possible, but I don't remember an instruction. Because, Chair, the government works in a particular way. If there is an instruction to the asset, as a shareholder, then there will be a shareholder memo to the chairperson of the board. And that would have been based on what the department would have sort of analyzed and advised the minister to do. I have not seen that. If it exists, then I'm happy to have a look at it. But I do not recall seeing that kind. And my discussions with Mr. Mkhwanazi, my recollection of how it started is I don't have a very good recollection.
Do you not recall him having said to you, even if he didn't talk about the minister having instructed the board, do you not recall him having said to you, for example, you know, the board is busy reviewing the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal. Even that, you don't think he said that?
No, that is true, that he would have said, because otherwise there would be no context to the brief.
Yes, yes.
So what I'm saying is I don't recall how, remember the boards, according to me, are separate from the minister. And if you're briefing me that this is what you are doing, and I must tell the shareholder that that's what you're busy with, that's how I would have engaged with this. That's why I don't recall saying, now I'm giving you an update based on the instruction I was given by the minister.
So it's the instruction by the minister part that you don't recall, but that the board was undertaking a review of the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal.
That was the essence
you
of
recall.
it. Yes, that was the essence of it. I think that's what we were dealing. The reason why he was telling me is that that's what they were busy with.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Mybeck?
All right. So I'm going to come to that in more detail. So you were appointed on the 1st of December. The 13th of December, we know that the new board commences its duties. You've accepted that that was a board appointed by Minister Gigaba. Now, another important event in this case is a public protector complaint that was received by Transnet on the 22nd of December. Did you ever come to learn about that?
I learned of that my memory was jogged by Mr. Mkhwanazi's evidence, I think, I don't remember the content, but I remember there was something about the public protector's report.
So just perhaps before we break for tea, you've mentioned to the chairperson that this initial discussion that you had with Mr. Mpoma, where you dealt with Mr. Sabugule, that would have happened in January. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. And are you able to assist us with when in January that was?
No, Chair. But it should be somewhere around the vicinity of that email. When I look at the email...
That email was another meeting that you had with Mr. Mkhwanazi. But let's leave it at that, Mr. Mahlangu. Perhaps over tea time you could reflect on when you first held a discussion in January with Mr. Mkhwanazi. Mr. Chairperson, if this is an appropriate time.
Okay, we'll take the tea adjournment until 11:30. We adjourn. Okay, let's continue.
Thank you.
I beg your pardon, Chair.
Yes.
May I be excused, please, at 12 o'clock?
That's
That
fine.
pleases the Chair.
That's
Thank
fine.
you, Chair.
Okay, all right.
Thank you. Mr. Mahlangu, just before we get to the approximate date of your first discussion with Mr. Mkonazi, can you remember what caused you to get in contact with him or him get in contact with you?
Perhaps, Chair, before I answer this question, I need to just put this forward. The events that you are seized with now happened around 9 years ago. So when I prepared the two affidavits, it was on the basis of what I remembered then. And from the day I received Mapoma's affidavit and the letter from the commission, I've been thinking about these matters. Some things don't make sense. Some things I'm not maliciously not remembering. And therefore, I would like you, as you assess what I'm with, is what I could remember. It's based on these two things, the two emails as I drafted the affidavit. But the conversation in my head hasn't stopped. So I would like you to allow me, where I can remember stuff, to indulge you. But right now, things are, I would like you to understand that I would like to be as helpful as I can to Mr. Maybeck and to the Commission.
Yes,
and therefore, I will not.
The fact that these are matters that happened a long time ago has got to be factored into the whole conversation. There's no doubt about that with every witness. And nobody asks you to talk about things that you know nothing about. Nobody asks you to remember what you can't remember. But obviously, there's got to be an assessment of what you have placed before the commission. And when Mr. Maybeck asks you questions about maybe some aspects, it's simply a way of him trying to understand as much as possible from you so that in the end he can assist me in evaluating your evidence as well as the evidence of other witnesses.
Thank you, Chair.
So perhaps we can then go back to my question. Do you recall what gave rise to your first discussion with Mr. Mkonazi?
No, I don't recall specifically.
Now,
But I would presume that Mr. Mkonazi would have called me because he had a direct relationship with the minister, and he also had access to all of the political office. So it would have been, he would call me. So I don't know at which point, which call came first.
in fact, Mr. Mkonazi's evidence is that you would phone him often.
That Chair, I think it would be on a specific issue if I would call. I wouldn't deny I called Mr. Mkonazi if I had a specific question.
Would you accept that you called him often?
As often as the other chairpersons, yes.
All right.
Or maybe a number of times.
Yeah, Chair, I don't know what often means, but it was not irregular to call Mr. Mkonazi if I had a question. But the often is not, I would call him every day or every second day.
Yeah.
If I had a question, and the question had to be something I needed clarity on, maybe there's a thing that I need to know that the minister or the administration is dealing with, and I needed context.
So would you say you may have called him often or a number of times in accordance with the requirements of your job?
Yes.
Piece of correspondence that we have, and it's going to be printed now, from Denise Rates relating to Mr. Gama was an offer made by them to Lange attorneys on the 13th of January. So we know that by this time you must have had this discussion, and Mr. Mkhwanazi would then have appointed Denise Rates and Mr. Goulet. Would you accept that?
I cannot recall, but,
Yes.
but what I see in my email is that I sent it in the evening at around 7.
That was after another discussion, Mr. Mahlangu. That's really the point I'm making. And please, if you could just listen to me instead of looking at the documents. You had a discussion where you put forward Mr. Goulet as an eminent labor lawyer. We know from Mr. Mkhwanazi's evidence that Transnet then appointed Mr. Goulet. On the 13th of January 2011, Mr. Goulet wrote to Lange attorneys making a without prejudice settlement proposal in respect of Mr. Gama. It must follow from that this discussion that you talk about here in paragraph 7 was a discussion that occurred before the 13th of January, correct?
It's possible,
Right.
but it's not also, it's possible, but that's not the only reasonable inference.
But Mr. Mahlangu, I don't want to argue with you about things that you yourself say. You don't have a perfect recollection of. What we know here, as a matter of fact, is that by the 13th of January, Goulet is on record as the attorney. Mr. Mkhwanazi says he took your advice. That's why he went to Goulet. It follows from that this discussion must have happened before then.
I accept.
Yeah, it is in fact the only reasonable inference.
No, I was trying to connect it to SMA2.
Well, I don't know what you were trying to do.
Yeah,
So
no, I was trying to see if we're talking about the SMA2, but if
that's what we're talking about. Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
And we're going to come to your email on the 18th. Of course, that followed another discussion that you had had with Mr. Mkhwanazi. We're going to come to that. Now, let me tell you what the issue is in relation to this discussion. I put to Mr. Mkhwanazi that based on my reading of your paragraph 6 and 7, it's your contention that Mkhwanazi tells you at this first discussion that Transnet intended to reinstate Gama. That's what I put to him. His answer was, no, that's not what he said to you. What he said to you is that the minister had issued an instruction that the board should review the fairness of Gama's dismissal. That's his version. Now, you understand part of my job is to put to you what he has to say, and you must comment on it. What do you say?
My statement, Mr. Mayberg and Chairperson, is that I had a number of discussions with Mr. Mkhwanazi. In one of those, I recommended...
Yeah, do raise your voice.
I had a number of discussions with Mr. Mkhwanazi, and I recommended that he seeks legal advice. And I do not recall specific that there was a review that the minister... I think what I was nervous about at the time was that if the board is acting without legal advice, which probably is the impression I got at the time, that would have been dangerous. So that's where I was.
Your
So
affidavit,
I can't comment on it.
so you stand by, as I understand it, your version being that Mr. Mkhwanazi told you that the Transnet intended to reinstate Gama.
That was my reading.
Right. Now, and that's important. Because
Yes, it's very important. But that's your recollection, is that right?
Yes, I think, Chair, even where I write, I say I understand. So it's what is the conclusion I drew from the discussion. I heard Mr. Mkhwanazi saying maybe I was premature. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but that's my impression of the facts and the discussion as they took place
You
at
see,
that time.
Mr. Mahlangu, you answer my question. You give a clear answer. You then learn of its importance.
No.
And then you try to take the edge off it. In paragraph 6, you say that Kwanazi informed you that the company intended to reinstate Mr. Gama. You didn't say I drew a conclusion or I inferred. I was informed. Correct.
Mr. Maybeck, let's go to Annexure SMA1, which is a contemporaneous record of the,
No, it's not. That was on the 18th.
I'm saying of the events at the time.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mahlangu. Look this side when you speak so I can hear you.
Oh, sorry, Chair.
Yes.
I was saying, Chair, there are two things. In the email that I wrote, I say I understand. This is on the 18th of Jan. And I said the sequencing here could be problematic for me. But there was a time I was told about the intended settlement. And we agree that it's before the 13th. There's a letter of the 13th. Yes, at that time I would have said that, go and get legal advice. Yes,
All right. Well, let's just stick with this. You stand by what you say in your affidavit.
yes.
All right, that's fine. So, why we pressed Mr. Makonazi on this is we said to him in cross-examination, but how could you say to Mr. Mahlangu before, and now we know the 13th of January, that you were going to reinstate Mr. Gama, unless you had been instructed to do so by Mr. Gigaba? That's really the proposition. And that's why the evidence that you've given here and confirmed is important. Do you follow that?
Yeah. Let's deal with this paragraph again. I'd like to go to it. Paragraph 6 of page
Page 170.
170.
That's your first affidavit.
Chair,
Yes.
this paragraph, like, there could be a timing around it, which is a problem. But there is a point. And as I had said to Mr. Maybeck, I'm prepared to take it that it might have been the 13th or before. But maybe that's my mischaracterization, whether they intended to review or reinstate. Chairperson, I cannot give you a firm, say, Mr. Mkhwanazi is wrong. But in my recollection seems to be the issue was the reinstatement. And I don't want to be too firm about it because I cannot.
But, Mr. Mahlangu, with all respect, you wrote this in your affidavit. I mean, as I understand it, you've said there's a lot of things you can't remember. But this you could remember, that's why you put it in here.
It is to the best of my recollection.
Fair enough.
And it could be that there are flaws in it. But there were those talks, whether it was a review, but there was an issue that there was something that being dealt with, which was around those times, having to do with Mr. Gama and his discussions with Transnet. And that is after he was dismissed. So I'm not so sure, Mr. Maybeck. And I take your point. I really take your point.
Mr. Mahlangu, I'm going to deal with this in argument and trace my way through the evidence that you've given. I think it'll speak for itself. Did you, during this discussion, come to learn of the involvement of the minister in any way whatsoever? Because Mr. Mkhwanazi is clear. He says that he told you that the minister had issued an instruction.
That I do not recall, Mr. Asi. And because what, you see, the difficulty there is that I come in December and I deal with this matter around January. So, and certain discussions, according to the evidence before the commission, had already taken place. So I'm not sure at what point of the discussions I was brought in and whether I was brought up to speed about the genesis of them, or to say there's this matter that is being dealt with and this is where it's at, and that's.
But I don't think there would have been much that would have happened before mid-January, because remember, Mr. Mkhwanazi and his board were also appointed in December. Actually, you were appointed first, I think. You said you appointed with effect from 1 December. I think they were appointed with effect from around 10 December or 13, I'm not sure, thereabout. And of course, there would have been the traditional, Christmas break, and people would have come back to work around 10 January 15. So I don't think that there would have been much that would have happened before mid-January.
I was saying, Chair, I was clarifying that there was a conversation that dates to October.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So what I'm saying in that conversation,
Yes.
I'm not sure at what point of that conversation I was brought in.
Yes.
But I don't recall there being, I've instructed Transnet to look at this matter. Can you follow up for me? Or whether Mkhwanazi said, as per your principal's instruction, here is the update. I don't recall it being that crisp.
Now, just remind me, why did you suggest they need legal advice? I mean, on your version, he says we're going to reinstate Gama. Well, fine. Why do you need legal advice?
Not we, Transnet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So why would Transnet need legal advice if it's decided to reinstate Mr. Gama?
I had said that I held a view that this matter was a little bit too complex. Well, of course, I didn't have a full appreciation.
You had a view.
Yes.
Yes.
That this matter raised very complex matters, and particularly there was a lot on the go, right? And it was also, in my opinion, if I had a preference, it was that you needed to deal with this matter clinically and try and contain whatever needed to be contained, whether it's the legal issues, the political issues, but that needed to be navigated with care. And if you're going to navigate this with care, you needed to act with legal advice.
So you understood that this was a controversial issue.
Yeah.
Right. And is it then just a coincidence that the lawyer who you pointed Transnet in the direction of, he then provides an opinion creating a slight doubt as to Transnet's prospects of success in the litigation against Mr. Gama, which they then accept and use that as a basis to reinstate him? Is that all a coincidence?
Chair, I can't comment on that.
All right.
I can't. What I can say is that as I got to Johannesburg in 1999 as a candidate attorney, I've done my stint in the employment law department. And of the eminent lawyers I recall of the time, labor lawyers, Sibukule ranked amongst them. And I did not give him only Sibukule. I recall that we discussed a number of names that he went away with. So I don't know about the opinion, I don't know about anything, but so far as Mr. Gule is concerned, he's one of the senior attorneys in the city with serious respect.
Well,
I think even articled with the DCJ.
do you know, or did Mr. Mkhwanazi
Well,
tell
he came as an attorney.
But did you know that Transnet, of course, already had lawyers on this case?
At that time,
Did you know that?
yes, no, I didn't know. I know that there were lawyers that were advising them on the Gama
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah.
But Mr. Mkhwanazi, remember the issue there, it was politically charged. And I think the law firm concerned was seen as part of the people that were purging
All right.
some people there.
So you accept that it was contentious and politically charged?
Yes.
All right. Now, I think I and the DCJ have already asked you a series of questions about this. So here we have the first discussion. I've mentioned to you that Mr. Mkhwanazi speaks of numerous or various discussions that you had with him. But he made it clear that he had a number of discussions with you after this in relation to Mr. Gama. and that those discussions were in the context of the minister's instruction. In other words, his evidence was that he was liaising with you in acquitting himself of the minister's instruction, and he was using you as a conduit to relay information to the minister. That's the extent of his recollection of his interaction with you. Now, do I understand you to be saying you can't remember that?
No, let me answer that, because the chairpersons don't have to speak to me. They speak to me because they want to convey something to my principal.
Look this
That's what he
side.
said.
The chairpersons did not speak to me for me. They would speak to me because they wanted to convey something to my principal or to assess where my principal stood on particular matters. So that would be correct.
So,
Actually, Mr. Mkhwanazi said, if I recall correctly, Mr. Maibek, other than the meeting that he had with Mr. Gigaba, which is said it was in October, other than that, he didn't have another meeting with him. I don't know whether before Mr. Gigaba was reinstated or he never had any other meeting at all, but it seems that certainly on his version, between the meeting that he says he had with the minister in October 2010 and the reinstatement of Mr. Gama, he says he never had any meeting with the minister. He was liaising with you as the person who would convey matters to the minister. Yes, Mr. Maibek.
yes, I mean, perhaps I could just read to you. I put to Mr. Mkhwanazi after a lengthy cross-examination. So you were keeping Mr. Mahlangu apprised of developments in the light of the instruction that you got from the minister to, as you put it, review Mr. Gama's dismissal. He says, I would have.
Chair, to the extent that I can recall, he did brief me he kept me abreast, but not on the details. But the important thing that we need to recall is that the chairpersons had an independent relationship with the minister. And their discussions with the minister were not just meetings, they would call him. They would call him because, and the minister would call them too, because I would have then said, Minister, there's this thing, and minister would then pick that up maybe through the department or directly with the chairperson. So I don't know, just to comment on the chair's remarks, I don't know if Mr. Mkhwanazi and my minister had discussions following those briefings.
Yes. But you see, Mr. Mahlangu, you're defecting now to discussions with the minister. I'm talking about the discussions he had with you, and no, I don't agree with you. The important thing is whether you came to learn through this series of discussions about the minister's instruction. That's the important thing.
I can't take it further, Mr. Maybeck.
Well, what is your answer? You can't
My answer
remember.
is that I cannot recall that Mr. Mkhwanazi said that to me.
Could he have?
I don't understand why,
Mr.
and I
Mahlangu,
don't understand why not. But I can't take it further than I cannot recall it, Chairperson.
well, then you can't dispute his version, can you? That he told you of the minister's instruction, and nor can you dispute his version that he then liaised with you on a number of occasions in acquitting himself of that instruction. You can't dispute that, can you?
Chair, I cannot dispute it because
Right.
I cannot recall it.
Now, let's then deal with how Mr. Mapoma enters the scene. We know that by the 11th of January, he had engaged KPMG to undertake an investigation of the Public Protector report. And his evidence and Mkhwanazi's evidence is that Mkhwanazi appointed him to deal with the Public Protector complaint. So he's now dealing with that at least from the 11th of January. And what is important about that and Mr. Mapoma's initial involvement. His evidence was that from the outset of his interactions with Mr. Mkonazi, he made it clear to him that he, Mkonazi, had been instructed by Mr. Gigaba, he had been instructed to reinstate Gama, and his evidence was that it was by someone higher up than the ministry. It was his evidence.
I can't comment.
How can that be?
I don't know that.
Well, if Mr. Mpoma is to be believed, Mr. Mkonazi told him that.
I can't comment on that.
Yes. And if Mkonazi told him that, presumably that instruction must have come from Mr. Gigaba and higher.
I can't comment on that. I don't know it.
Then, whilst we're on Mr. Mpoma and his initial interaction, he also talks about a meeting that he attended between Mkonazi and Gama over the weekend at the Ananda estate. And there was an attempt to negotiate a settlement, so we know this is before the settlement agreement. And those negotiations were unsuccessful, and Mapoma's evidence was that Mkonazi tells him that they broke down because Gama wanted to be appointed, it's something that you were dealing with, as the chief executive of Transnet. You find that strange?
I don't know the facts.
Assuming that happened, would you find that strange?
Yes, that's strange.
And would you accept that it's indicative of the fact that Mr. Gama must then have had some very serious political backing, correct?
I don't know that. I can't comment.
But why is that not indicative of the fact that Mr. Gama, if it happened,
I'm not qualified to comment on that. I don't know how to draw politically.
your reaction is immediate. You don't even allow me to finish the proposition. And it's not a matter of qualification. I'm asking you, what else? What else could have informed that stance by Mr. Gama?
I don't know, Chair.
Yeah. Fair enough.
I guess that what you could say is that that somebody who was dismissed from a certain position, who has got an unfair dismissal claim against the company, wanting to be reinstated to that position from which he was dismissed, should, in negotiations aimed at settling that dispute, demand to be appointed to a higher position is strange, would be strange. I guess that you can say.
I've said, Chair.
Yeah.
You mentioned then in your supplementary affidavit, just following the chronology, that you would have held a discussion with Mr. Mkonazi around the 18th of January, and that leads us to your 18th January email, correct?
Yes.
So let's go then to that email at page 178, bundle 1. Now, the first bullet point says, I've been invited on a trip to India on 24 January to 1 February. Although this is a private excursion, it promises to be of great political value. I therefore suggest that we take full advantage of it. I therefore request leave to undertake this sojourn. Is that right?
That's correct.
And did you then undertake this trip to India?
I deal with this, Chair, in a separate affidavit that I filed with the Commission.
And I've read that affidavit. Your version is that you were invited by Ranesh Gupta to attend a wedding of one of his family members and that he paid for you.
Chairperson, I was asked to prepare to deal with the Transnet issues, and I deal extensively about my relationship with the members of the Gupta family. And I have not prepared today to deal with that, but to Mr. Maybeck's point, there was no discussion between the members of the Gupta family and me about Mr. Gama, and neither do I think at that time they even knew each other. I don't know. The impression I recall is that at that time, they had not asked anything of me. They had not they were not infamous. But I would like, Chair, to deal with it appropriately and to be able to adequately address
Absolutely.
it.
Okay.
I don't intend to pursue that any further. Of course,
Yes.
I mean, the point I just wanted to make really is it's because of that this email came to light, because you were preparing the other affidavit.
That's correct.
The other affidavit asked you to answer to this trip to India, and you then produced this, I think it was, as Annexure 17, and it was in the context of preparing that affidavit that you then realized you should put this up in this,
That is correct.
in this, these proceedings.
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
All right. And you're right, you will, in time, you may be called as a witness to answer those allegations. Let's get then to the second bullet point. I understand that Transnet may be nearing a settlement with Gama. I will obtain the details of the settlement and brief you accordingly. I suggest that you socialize the President and his key aides, in brackets formal and informal, on the proposed settlement. It's intended that the forthcoming board should consider and authorize it. So here, this is contemporaneous. You had a discussion with Mr. Mkonazi, you say, in the lead up to this email, and that's what he told you.
Yes.
Just so that we understand it, you can't remember that. That's your case. But you're saying, well, if I wrote it, well, then it must have happened.
I've tried to explain it after break,
Yeah.
Mr. Maybeck. At the time when I drafted the affidavit, the only recollection of this was this email.
Yes.
But I've been continuously thinking and trying to understand and trying to contextualize these issues and to place them in, to try to go back into history. So I would like you to understand it in that regard.
All right. Now, what's important is when I put this to Mr. Mkwanazi, he says, no, he didn't say this to you, because as of the 18th, they weren't nearing a settlement. And ultimately, in fact, said that you made a false report to the minister.
I think that, Mr. Maybeck, I watched the video of Mr. Mkwanazi's evidence. I think that was that concession that he made it under intense questioning and all of that. But his view was that I prematurely.
It wasn't a concession. He said you made a false statement to the minister. Presumably you don't agree with him.
I don't agree.
Yeah.
And the facts don't agree.
Yeah, well, precisely. And that was the point I was putting to him. So you and I agree with one another. So he must have told you.
I think the false part came because it was said if what you were saying was premature, okay, I think I asked him pertinently. I said, when he said it was premature, is it because it was true, but it should not have been conveyed at that time? It was not the right time to tell the minister? Or was the position that as at that time, what you said had happened, had not happened? And my recollection is that his response was that what you said had happened, had not happened. That's my recollection. Is it consistent with your recollection of what you listened to?
Chair, I wouldn't want to labor on it too much.
Yes.
What I wrote to the minister here, as you can tell, it's my understanding.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And it probably is just simply a timing issue at worst. You say that I will obtain details of the settlement. In other words, the settlement agreement, or what did you have in mind of giving to the minister?
If you read the two emails, I think later on I do talk about loss of benefits and something like that in SMA 2.
Mr. Mahlangu, what details did you intend to get for the minister?
On what basis is he being, what is the settlement? What is it?
In other words, a settlement agreement.
Yes, the contents.
And did you then do that?
No,
How do you remember that?
because that's significant. It's a very significant event.
But so is this email.
No, I'm saying the details of it would be
Yeah.
important. Because remember, in my next email,
Yeah.
I seem to know about, if you go to my second email, I said he was informed through his lawyer of an offer to reinstate him with no loss of benefits and a contribution towards his legal costs. That's probably what I meant, but I have no independent.
So in other words, I think you had said earlier that you didn't do this, but it seems that you did do that. You did get details then of the settlement.
Not the agreement. The agreement, I saw it for the first time when the commission gave it.
I see. How do you know that you didn't look for the settlement agreement?
There are certain important life events.
Right.
Like, I don't know, like I was telling you about.
You would describe getting a settlement agreement from Transnet as an important life event.
On a matter relating to Mr. Gama, it's important.
Just so that we understand one another, your evidence here is you have no independent recollection of this.
But I've said this, Chair, that when I drafted the affidavits on those 2 days, these affidavits, that's all I heard. But doesn't mean I've stopped inquiring about these
All right.
matters.
Then you suggest that you socialize the president. Just remind me what your answer was to the chairperson's question about what does that mean?
By socialized, Chair, I meant that he must make him aware because of the importance of the matter. The matter had evoked public interest, and in fact, there are two things there. The matter was of public interest, and the matter is what the public was interested in at the time.
Well, I think that is important evidence that you give. Now, not only was he to socialize the president, was your advice, but also his key aides. Who would that have included?
Aides in the political context means the assistants and advisors of the president, the inner sanctum of the president.
And you say, but it's not just formally those aides, it's also informal aides. What, just before you jump in, who would have the president's informal aides have included?
That would have been some of the senior political leaders that were closer to the president.
Like, who did you have in mind?
I have to think back, but you know, the ANC has got its different compartments, and you have to make sure that at that time, those that are allied to the president would also have to have had their say.
They would have had to have had their say
To the president,
about the reinstatement of Mr. Gama.
yes.
I see.
That's why you'd see in my SMA 2, I think, I repeat the political problems that I saw with this.
But doesn't this evidence of yours make it all the more probable that Mr. Mkhwanazi was instructed by the former president via your minister to reinstate Mr. Gama?
No.
So your evidence was that you felt that the aides, the key aides, both formal and informal, should have their say about the reinstatement of Mr. Gama?
Yes, Mr. Maybeck. Let me put this in context. Firstly, for me, the public interest is that Transnet is one of the biggest organizations in the country and the biggest employer. Secondly, Transnet Freight Rail runs 80% of Africa's rail. So in terms of public interest to me, the importance of Transnet Freight Rail was not lost. The politicization of this matter was also not lost to me. If the president, if Mr. Gigaba, in my view, now in hindsight, had not, if there's something as big as that, whether he's not being taken or he's being taken back, that I think he should have briefed the president, because somehow that matter would at least be in the public domain and he will need the president's support.
He had the president's support.
I don't know. I'm briefing you. And as we did some things, as we would go, there would be matters that you would know. You would say, Mr. Minister, we think that when this thing backfires, you want to have the president's backing. So that is the background to which that thing was. And you would see in that email, there's a lot of correspondence with the presidency on unrelated issues where we're trying to make sure that he is in a very good relationship with the high office.
All right. And then you go on to say that it's intended that the forthcoming board should consider and authorize it. What did you mean by that? Forthcoming board meeting, or?
I would presume it's the meeting, Mr. Maybeck.
Because you see, that's also very important. Because if this is what Mr. Mkonazi told you, well, then what it shows you is that his intention was to persuade his board to reinstate Gama at the forthcoming meeting.
I can't comment on that.
But he told you that.
I stand by this email.
Yeah. All right. Now, let us deal then with over the page. At
Well,
page
before you
180.
go over the page, Mr. Maybeck,
Yes, Chairperson.
Mr. Mahlangu, your statement in that first bullet point, in that email of 18 January 2011, in the second bullet point, your suggestion to the minister that he socializes the president and his key aides on the proposed settlement suggests to me, and I would like to hear your comment, suggests to me that it's unlikely that there had not been a discussion involving you and the minister, in terms of which you had formed the impression or understanding that the president was interested to be informed about what was going on with regard to the Gama dispute. Is that a fair reading or analysis of that statement?
No, Chair.
Yes. What do you say to this?
In the nature of my work, Chair, I would determine, in my view, whether this is a, remember, Chair, I took a view that the executive powers in the Republic vest in the President. And therefore, every minister is a counselor of the President. although they have those delegated powers that they must discharge. And therefore, if there's something that has particular sensitivities, you would do good, in my view, to appraise the president before you take that step. And we've seen ministers over the years who have taken steps without briefing the president, and then you have ways in which then there's a public or a concern from the disjuncture between the presidency and those ministers about the meaning or intended action by those ministers. So from my point, as I said, and it's not this one, there are many other instances where I would say, talk to your colleagues, appraise the president, so that we were able to make sure that when we take steps like those, where we would need backing from the highest office in the land, that backing was available. Particularly if there is a misstep, you really need to be understood. Yes.
You see, that thinking comes from this, that I would expect that a special advisor to the minister would leave it to the minister's judgment what he tells the president and what he doesn't tell him, and when he tells him, and that the special advisor would simply advise the minister, and the minister has a certain relationship with the president and how they interact. But that might that you might not share that, but that's what I'm thinking.
That is a mistaken view, Chair.
Yeah.
That's not practically how it works.
You would advise the minister.
You tell him sometimes he would overrule you if he doesn't believe it's important. There are instances where we were overruled.
So your advice to him would include what to bring to the attention of the president as well.
That's correct, Chair.
Okay, but I see also that in terms of that statement, it seems that you considered that it was important not just that the president should be informed about Mr. Gama's possible reinstatement or intended reinstatement, but that he should be informed of the settlement, and I take it you mean the terms of the settlement. Is that fair to read it like that?
I think, Chair, that is correct. And
Yes.
yeah, let me leave it at that.
Yeah, okay, all right. Mr. Maibek?
Yes, thank you. So, did Mr. Gigaba socialize the president, Gigaba socialize the president and his key aides?
I don't know, Chair.
Did you not follow up with him?
I may have, like I said, there's memory lapses there. I don't know.
There's memory lapses.
I'm saying I cannot recall. Maybe that's an inelegant use of language, but I cannot recall, Mr. Mayor.
Because let's go to page 180. You say, we shall take discussions on some of these matters eyeball to eyeball. Does that not help you jog your memory?
I'm not sure if I used some of these things, I would use them to, these emails, I would send them to the minister so that in case we don't. Sometimes the minister is in Cape Town, sometimes I'm in Pretoria. Sometimes we're both at the same geography. But the important thing is that I do not recall him going to the president. If he did, I mean, the minister is around, he can testify to that.
Yes, well, it seems the minister might have to update his affidavit or supplement it like you did after your testimony.
I do not recall.
Because the minister, he puts up a one-paragraph affidavit where he says he knows nothing about this at all, which your evidence shows can't be true.
I can't comment on the minister's side.
Well, you said that as special advisor to the minister, you would advise and it would be up to the minister to take your advice or not to take it. And I think there are a number of examples that you have made in one of your affidavits where you say he didn't take your advice, he took the advice of other colleagues of yours or other people in the department. I would have thought that whether he socialized whether he went along with your advice, that he should socialize the president, whether he went along with that advice or not would have been quite important for you to know for further advice, because maybe if the president wasn't happy or was happy might influence how you advise him going forward.
Chair, in an ideal circumstance, yes. But in the political and administrative centers, things happen rapidly. And you leave it, you've advised, and you then are sure that the minister then is aware of your advice. That's your primary issue. So in this instance, Chair, consistent with the work that we're doing there, I would have to check something else to confirm whether he did or didn't, and whether we had a further discussion after that. I don't have any specific recollection. I don't dispute that it would have been important to follow up, but right now I do not have enough facts to assist you with that.
But what would you need to check, Mr. Mahlangu?
I'm saying I would have to look at the correspondence between me and the DG, or the DG, internal correspondence within the department at that time. Whether there was any formal letter written to the president, or whether there was any diary entry, requested
All
meeting
right,
with the
just
president.
please speak to the chairperson.
Oh,
directly.
sorry. I would have had to verify from objective evidence within the department whether the minister did or reported back to us.
So as things stand now, you don't know whether Minister Gigaba did that, but your advice was that he certainly should.
Yes.
All right. So that's the 18th of January. We know then from the 24th of January to the 1st of February, you go to India. Okay? So that gets
I'm not
us,
sure if the dates are correct, but yes, I did.
well, that's what you are. You asked for leave from, if you go to your bullet point 1.
Yes, I'm saying I'm not sure if those, eventually that was the date,
All right.
but somewhere around those times.
So on those dates that you gave the minister, your trip was planned from 24 January to 1 February. Now, just to follow the chronology, on the 21st of January, that was the first board meeting, Transnet, where Mr. Gama was discussed. I'm trying to trace the steps to your next email of the 4th of February. So we know you're back on or about the 1st or 2nd of February. There's a board meeting on the 21st of January, and now I want to get to the meeting that was held the day before your 4 February email. And that was a meeting of the Corporate Governance and Nominations Committee. Perhaps I could ask you please to go to file 1, bundle 1.
Bundle 1, that's the one we've got.
And that's the one that has got your emails. That's the one that has got your emails, SMA1 and
Thank you, Chair.
SMA2.
Thank you, Chair.
And so, yes, I beg your pardon, it's the same file. Can you turn all the way to page 855?
855.
Now this is the meeting that precedes your discussion and email of the next day. Perhaps, in fairness, let me take you to page 827 first.
827.
827. So you see there minutes of a meeting, Corporate Governance and Nomination Committee on 3 February 2011, present Mr. Mkonazi, etc. You see that?
Yes.
And then at 1.4 also Mr. Mpoma.
Yes.
Now, the business of this committee, Mr. Mahlangu, on this day, was by and large to debate whether or not Mr. Gama, his application for the position of Group Chief Executive should be allowed. And whether there should be a deviation from what is known as clause 4.8.4, which says as a general rule, if you're dismissed, you can't be re-employed. So that was the debate, and we know that you deal with this in your email of the 4th of February, further to a discussion you had with Mr. Mkonazi. Now, I'm referring you now to page 855. This is part of the transcript, and at 855, at line 695 on the left-hand side, Mr. Mkonazi had asked Mr. Mpoma to give his view on Mr. Gama's dismissal, the issue of settlement, etc. And this is the passage where he says, now I advise the chair to say if we as Transnet go to the appeal and oppose the appeal, that's the arbitration, we stand a very good chance of winning that appeal. That was my view at the time. Where I'm saying we are not strong, Doris, that's the director, is if we have to explain the rationality of why we're settling, I don't think we're on very strong ground on that. That is my view, but on the disciplinary process itself, and if we go and argue the matter on appeal, we stand a very good chance of succeeding. SIA can win, but we can also win as Transnet. We have a very, very good case against him there. So, it seems then that the discussion that you have with Mr. Mkonazi on the 4th of February, which then gives rise to your email, it's in this context, a debate about allowing Mr. Gama's application, correct?
Yes.
What's also important for the purposes of your evidence, and we're going to come to just now, is do you see how Mr. Mpoma is really dead against settlement?
Yes.
In fact, he says it would be irrational to settle.
Yes.
Do you see that? And Mr. Mpoma was as forthright when it came to the issue of the payment of Mr. Gama's costs. You might have seen his, listened to his evidence.
I did.
He was utterly opposed to the payment of Mr. Gama's costs. You would have heard that, correct?
I saw the evidence.
So let us then go to your email of the next day, the 4th of February. We need to go back, please, to page 181 of this bundle. And here you say, on the 4th of February...
Wait for me, Mr. Mayor.
181, your second email.
Yes.
You say, Dear Minister, at my meeting with Chair, I assume that's Mr. Mkonazi, is that right?
Yes, that's the email.
And your supplementary affidavit says that you would have held that meeting on or about the same day.
Probably.
And really what you discussed with him was this issue of Mr. Gama and his application for Group Chief Executive, correct?
That's correct.
And along the way, you also discussed with him the issue of a settlement with Mr. Gama.
That is correct.
Now the two things were intertwined, weren't they?
In my view, they were.
Because
They were or they went?
They were.
They were, okay.
Yes.
I want to put to you why, possibly why they were intertwined, is if Barbara Hogan's evidence is to be accepted, former President Zuma always wanted Mr. Gama to be appointed as the chief executive of Transnet. Now, that position was vacant at this time. In order for Mr. Gama to get that job, he would first have to be reinstated at Transnet Freight Rail, because his prospects of landing the job of Group Chief Executive of Transnet, where his status was a former dismissed Chief Executive of Transnet Freight Rail, presumably would not be very good. Is that not why these two things were actually interlinked?
That's not how I understood them. I can explain why I thought they were interlinked.
Yes, please do.
And this is, maybe the facts may not, it's from memory as I battle with these matters. I think around 2008, thereabout, towards the end of Ms. Ramos's term as Group Chief Executive, there was a process that was run to get the new Group Chief Executive. And then Mr. Gama was shortlisted amongst the candidates for Group Chief Executive. It was now Minister Kodan, then Mr. Gama, and I think there was a Mr. Loti. Those were the front runners.
Who was the third one?
The first one was Minister Pravin Gordhan. But at that time he wasn't minister, he was considered for the position of Group Chief Executive. Then it was Mr. Gama and Mr. Loti. The first name, I don't recall. Those were the three front runners. Then, I don't know what interventions at political level, but that's February 2009. Then I think they couldn't close out on that matter because they were informed, whether by the ANC or whoever informed the board of Transnet, I think there should be records of that somewhere, that they can't go ahead with Mr. Gordhan because he was going to go to cabinet in the elections of 2009. So then you are left with Mr. Gama and Mr. Loti. And I don't know if they were ranked, but on hindsight, I think there was an expectation that Mr. Gama was a number 2. Then that process doesn't get wrapped up on whether they reject the 2 or they don't reject the 2. I think that process then goes on, and then the disciplinary inquiries come in the middle of it, right up to when this matter then, you have now, there was an allegation that the sole purpose of the disciplinary proceedings against Gama were to stop him from being Group Chief Executive. So that's how, in my assessment at the time, these things were intertwined. That's how I understood them, Mr. Maybeck.
Well, just for the record, Mr. Paswana, Frederick Paswana, was chairperson of the board of Transnet at the time. He now lives in Belgium. The commission obtained from him an affidavit last year, and it had asked him to tell it what he knows about these matters. In his affidavit, which the commission has, he has made it clear that this story that Mr. Gama was ever candidate number 2 was not true. That was never the case. That's his evidence on affidavit before the commission. I just thought I would mention that for the record, but I accept that you are saying what you understood
That's what
at the time.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah.
So that's the interlinking.
Yes.
So that's what I understood to be the interlink between the two.
Okay.
All right. So that's the 4th of February. Now, we know that the settlement agreement was signed or concluded on the 23rd of February. I want to get to the alleged telephonic discussion between you and Mr. Mapoma. Now, you talked about the probabilities, and I'm going to come to your version and we're going to go through what you say in your affidavit about this. But I just want to suggest to you that there are 5 things that appear to indicate that it's probable that you did phone Mr. Mapoma. The first thing is that your minister either wanted or had issued an instruction that Gama be reinstated, or at very least that there be a review undertaken of the fairness of his dismissal. Now, I'm putting to you that in fact happened. You say you can't remember that. Correct?
Yes.
So, of course, if it did happen, it creates the context, doesn't it, for you contacting Mapoma?
No, Chair. If you go to my SMA 2,
Yes.
you would know that I had a view that this matter was ultra sensitive.
Yes.
And I wouldn't have instructed somebody to do what I wouldn't do.
But you haven't told us, and you can't remember what the minister's response was to your SM2A2.
I wouldn't be, you see, Mr. Maybeck,
Yes.
it is improbable because of the views I held. I thought this is a matter that required careful consideration and care. And therefore, I wouldn't have phoned Mr. Mapoma and told him to expedite.
Is what required
This-
careful consideration and care, if you look at SM2, is particularly the decision as to whether he should be a candidate for the chief executive
Not
position.
only, it's not only, it gives you the context.
Yes.
It gives you the context. That's why I said, Mr.
Please speak to the chairperson and not me.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Chair. The letter gives you the context. Where I do say, Chair, if there's anything matters of discipline left with Mr. Gama because they were not resolved, then they must be dealt with by the board and the new GCE going forward. I wasn't pushing for a settlement.
Of course, that might hold if you are talking about acting in accordance with what you believed should happen. But if you were instructed to speak to Mr. Mapoma and to say he must expedite the reinstatement, then irrespective of what your views may have been, you would have carried that instruction out, would you not have?
No, Chair, I wouldn't.
Why would you not have done that?
Because, Chair, that's not how the minister worked. The minister wouldn't have forced me to act against
But
my
if he
conscience.
did,
He wouldn't, Chair. It's not factual.
eh?
It's not factual, Chair. He wouldn't. He wouldn't. He would reject my advice, and in case he would either send somebody else or phone the chair or something like that. But in addition to my statement that it's improbable, Chair, it's that where I functioned, because I knew that I'm functioning for and on behalf of the office of the minister, I wouldn't go 3 levels down at Transnet to pressure somebody to do something, Chair.
Well, let us come to that, Mr. Mahlangu. Just that you understand, Mr. Makwanazi's own evidence is that he was instructed by the minister to at least undertake a review of the fairness of Gama's dismissal. That's his evidence.
Yes.
So, but I think we're talking about
So
different.
when you say things don't work like that and that would never have happened, that's what his evidence is.
Chair, let's deal with this properly. We're talking about 2 things which we must make very clear. First, it's whether I pressured Mapoma. 2, it's whether the minister instructed Mr. Mkwanazi. Those are factually separate. I am saying, insofar as my discussion with Mr. Mapoma, right? There is no way I would have instructed him because I believed, Chair, that this matter was a sensitive matter and needed care. That's the first thing. Secondly, Chair, I had no instruction from my minister to go and pressure Transnet. Let's assume for a second, which just for the purposes of argument, had I been so instructed, I would have had a meeting with Mr. Mkwanazi where I pressure him, had I been so instructed. That's the level at which I operated, Chair. The only basis for any phone call, if any, to Mr. Mapoma would be on the basis of our social and professional relationship that we enjoyed, not to pressure him.
What if you spoke to Mr. Mkwanazi and he said, you know, it's Mr. Mapoma who is holding this thing up, where the two of you know each other, talk to him?
No, Chair. Mr. Mkwanazi was the group chief executive, acting group chief executive, and Mr. Mkwanazi was the chairperson of the board. That's where Mr. Mkwanazi would have gone and done his homework and reported back to me, if that was the case.
So, Mr. Mahlangu, I can see here you are very well prepared and seemingly have a very clear recollection of things. Let's take this one at a time, just so that you understand. The case that will be advanced in relation to your evidence is that an instruction actually, so whether this call took place must be seen in the context of it will be submitted, there was an instruction. Now, you can deny that, but Mkwanazi himself says there was an instruction. So that's point one. Point number two is, I've shown you that Mpoma was opposed to this settlement and he was opposed to the issue of costs. You can't dispute that.
Yes, because he was opposed. I was cautious, as you can see in my...
You can't dispute that he was opposed.
No.
Yes.
But Mr. Maybeck, you're downplaying an important point.
Yeah.
This is Mr. Mapoma that I know well. And he's like an elder brother to me in that community of us. And we met often. And I've asked around ever since I got this affidavit on, did he ever say this about, did anything? Because for 9 years of my life, I lived not knowing that Mr. Mapoma, there's an issue between me and Mr. Mapoma, Chairperson.
So-
It's not just there's a link between me and Mr. Mapoma.
Mr. Mahlangu,
Of course, what is interesting is that two persons here speak about instructions. Mr. Mapoma talks about an instruction. He tells about you pressuring him and saying, according to him, number one wants this done quickly. And then Mr. Mkwanazi also talks about there having been an instruction. He talks about an instruction that he says, came from the minister at the meeting that he had with the minister in October, which might have been November. Mr. Maibet might have a better recollection, but I seemed to think when Mr. Mkwanazi was giving evidence that he may have initially said that the minister had instructed him to reinstate Mr. Gama, but upon further questioning said the instruction was to review the fairness. Now, I may have misunderstood, I may be wrong to say he might have said the minister instructed him to reinstate. Maybe he said to review, but in the end, his evidence was the minister did not instruct me to reinstate. Mr. Gama instructed the board to review the fairness of Mr. Gama's dismissal. That was his final evidence. So you have these two persons both talking about instructions, and some of the evidence between the two of them, they don't agree with everything that each one says, but they both have these parts of their evidence talking about instructions. I'm just mentioning that to bring that to your attention. You might not want to comment or say anything about it, or you might want. But I'm just saying there is this very interesting feature that both of them seem to talk about instructions.
Chair, my comment is that the views I held at the time are inconsistent with any intention or motive to pressure Mr. Mapoma. If you look at it, I do say, Chair, in the end of SMA 2, that the matter surrounding his dismissal, Gama that is, may be dealt with by the GCE and the board going forward. So I was not in a hurry for anything.
Mr. Mahlangu, the problem is that's on the 4th of February. The settlement happens on the 23rd of February. And you aren't able to tell us what came of your advice to Mr. Gigaba that he socializes the president. You aren't able to tell us whether he took any of this advice here. This is a dynamic situation. I mean, how do we know that things didn't change? The 4th of February, in the context of this matter, 3 weeks later, there's a settlement.
Chair, other than to say that I did not agitate for the settlement, and that it is, I therefore had no reason to pressure Mr. Mapoma, I can't take it further than that.
So the third thing that I wanted to say to you that put to you that the probabilities reflect that you would have called him. One, we've dealt with the instruction. Two, we've dealt with Mapoma being opposed to settlement. And the third point was the point that you say I'm downplaying. The fact is you did know Mr. Mapoma and you knew him very well, correct?
Yes, and I knew him as an elder brother in
and
our
we're going to come to that because that's the next point. So you make my points for me. Why would an elder brother, both of you have mutual respect for one another? This is a mentor of yours.
I wouldn't take it that far.
Well, we can go to the language. But you revered him. You gave him the same respect as you do, you say, for elder siblings. Why does this person then, all of a sudden, make up this version? That's the key issue.
I'm asking that same question. I've been asking it the same day I got that affidavit.
So, an instruction, Mapoma was opposed, you knew Mapoma well, and you can't think of one single reason, is that right? Why you would make up, before you answer, please let me finish. You can't think of one single reason why you would make up that version.
Chair, I can't, and I don't, it's inconsistent also with my being chair. Where I have wronged a person, and I believe that I have actually did, I would reach out to that person. This hasn't happened in this matter.
Sorry, Mr. Mahlangu, if you don't mind. That's gilding the lily. You accept that you can't think of one single reason. You're now giving an explanation about your personality and the like. That doesn't go to my question. My question is you can't think of one single reason why Mapoma would falsely implicate you, can you?
Chair, I cannot.
Right. And here's the fifth point that really is determinative.
Chair, what I must make clear is that the fact that I cannot, it doesn't mean there isn't.
And you've had a long time to think about a reason, haven't you?
I've worked out a few theories which
Yes.
I think are speculative.
So let's come to the fifth point that really is determinative. So we have the instruction, the fact that he was opposed, the fact that you knew him well, the fact that you can't think of even one reason why I would make this up. The fifth point is the day after the discussion, he went to Mr. Makonazi and he told him that you had phoned him and that he had told you off. And he alerted Mr. Makonazi because he was concerned that the minister would phone and complain. So if that really determines this.
Chair, I received no phone call from Mr. Mkwanazi on this matter, and he never discussed it with me.
But
I
that's,
deny, Chair, vehemently that I pressured Mr. Mapoma.
Mr. Mahlangu, perhaps you should just stick with us if you don't mind. I mean, I know what your defense is, but I'm putting propositions to you that you need to deal with. Mr. Makonazi, why you accept that if Mr. Mpoma reported this to Mr. Makonazi, then the call must have happened. Do you accept that?
Chair, I'm unable to enter into this
Yes, okay.
discussion because I would not know the discussions between Mr. Mapoma and Mr. Mkwanazi.
All right. But you're not suggesting to the chairperson that there could have been no discussion, and then one day you woke up and decided that I'm going to go and tell Mr. Makonazi that I was phoned by Mr. Gigaba's special advisor, and this is what happened. He couldn't simply have made that up, could he?
I don't know. I mean, this is his evidence alone.
Yes. And what's also important, and Mr. Mahlangu, I'm sure you appreciate the difficulty that it presents. What's also important is that Mr. Makonazi can't remember that, but he doesn't deny it.
But what I can tell you is, why would I pressure a person to do something that he's incapable of doing?
We're dealing with these facts because that single fact will be determinative potentially of your entire version.
Yes, but
So let's just deal with that, please.
Chair, what I'm trying to explain is that I've been I'm a very senior person. I've been functioning at that level. I knew what Mr. Mapoma can deliver and couldn't deliver. And his boss at the time, Ms. Zola Stevens, had reached out to me on an unrelated matter when they knew of my presence at the DPE, and introduced herself at breakfast and told me that if I need any questions of a legal nature and things like those, I could approach her. And I also just took that meeting as courtesy. But by and large, Chair, my area of operation did not go beyond the EXCO and the board because of the nature of the matters I dealt with. Mr. Mapoma couldn't expedite anything. It wasn't his job to reinstate Mr. Gama.
Well,
No.
you see, in order to say that you need to know when the call is alleged to have taken place, because if the call had happened maybe when an in-principle agreement had been reached, but there was some paperwork to be done, it may be that he was alleged to be delaying Mr. Gama's reinstatement by not ensuring that the necessary paperwork was done expeditiously, isn't it? So you need to know what it is. He couldn't make the decision to reinstate him, but he could implement whatever he was instructed that would ensure that the reinstatement took place, isn't it?
Chair, that would be a stretch from my part to reach out to that. And Chair, that's even on the assumption that I did.
Yeah, of course.
So Chair, I want to say to you that the propositions that Mr. Maybeck put for me, they need to be read against the fact that I was not personally invested in the reinstatement or settlement. And in fact, my view as of 4 February was that this could be dealt with in due course.
Mr. Mahlangu, but this case is not about your personal investment. I mean, when we went to your first email, you said, look, I wrote that to the minister. I'm just a mere aide. He must do what he must do. This case is not about your personal investment. It's about your minister's personal investment. Now, I'm going to go back to my list because you haven't been able to think of one reason why Mr. Mpoma would fabricate his evidence about the telephone call. Can you think of a single reason why he would have made a false report about the call to Mr. Makwanazi? Can you think of any single reason?
Chair, I don't know if he did, and I do not want to venture into that.
Yes, I think that, well, you have said in your affidavit you have a certain level of respect for Mr. Mpoma. For that reason, you might not be wanting to attribute any evil intentions on his part, but I can say that not all his evidence that he gave before me was without questions. There were some aspects that needed some explanation. There are some aspects that will need thorough and careful consideration on my part. There were, I think Mr. Maibek might recall, there were aspects that I think he could not explain. I think one of which was the very emphatic advice he gave or opinion he gave that Transnet's case against Mr. Gama in terms of dismissal was very strong at the meeting. Mr. Maibek referred you to those minutes, and he had also given evidence before that he had not formed any opinion on the case. So I'm just saying, although Mr. Maibek is inviting you to give any reasons you can think of about why he might have falsely said you pressured him, and you maybe out of respect don't want to say anything about attributing any evil intentions on his side. Not all aspects of his evidence was without question marks. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Maibek, I hope I've
Yes, no, absolutely.
put it fairly, yeah.
And then, just to finalize this issue of the discussion, right? Did you write this affidavit, the first affidavit, yourself?
Yes, I did. I was assisted by counsel.
Yes, and you've been in it, or have been a lawyer for a very long time.
That's correct.
When you read it in preparation for this evidence today, do you believe that the points you make here have merit?
Yes, I do.
Do you honestly believe that?
Yes, Mr. Maibek.
So let's
I
go.
really do.
Let's go to page 173. And you say, "Well, I wouldn't have called him because really I respect him, and we have a common social circle." Is that right?
Yes.
But that's why you called him, because you knew him, because you respected him.
No, Mr. Maibek, I think we're conflating things. I'm saying I wouldn't have pressured him or being rude to him.
He doesn't say you were rude to him.
No, pressuring in the way that we relate.
Yes.
Maybe there's a cultural difference there,
Yes.
Mr. Maibek. You can't pressure your elder. You can't.
Right.
It's not something we do.
Well, can't you pressure your elder respectfully?
But you persuade, Chair. And
Yes.
if not, you don't. So what I'm trying to say, Chair, I did not. I did not. And the way, Chair, I wish I could play out how we used to live between 1999 and 2010-ish, thereabout in that. And why he denies that he was at those braais with us, I don't know, Chair.
So, Mr. Mahlangu, then I must also put to you, we've dealt with the motive and reason. Then you say, well, I would have raised these issues with Mr. Mkhwanazi, but that's the point. You see, what I want to put to you, an analysis of the evidence may very well reflect in this case, that Mr. Mkhwanazi was only too keen to do this deal and give Mr. Gama whatever he wanted. The person that was opposed to this, certainly in relation to costs, was Mr. Mpoma. So it wouldn't help you to phone Mr. Mkhwanazi. Mr. Mkhwanazi wasn't the problem.
Chair, I think what I'm saying is that Mr. Mkhwanazi did not tell me that Mr. Mapoma had certain concerns about me. That I don't know. I have lived, like I said, 9 years.
No, Mr. Mkhwanazi did not say he called you about that. He also said he did not recall whether Mr. Mapoma had told him that you had called him pressurizing him.
And then this paragraph where you say, well, I don't refer to a sitting president as number one. I mean, you can't suggest that's persuasive.
With respect,
Yes.
it depends from which political tradition you emerge from.
Yes.
Some called them chief in a particular era, during the Mbeki era. With me, it's always been JZ or TM, or those. It's in your daily grind.
Did you phone this man or not?
I don't know if I phoned the man as a matter of a physical phone call, Chair, because I knew the gentleman well. I cannot deny that I placed a physical call, but that call would have been predicated on my social relations with him.
Well,
I did not call him, Chair, to pressure him.
This is a very important evidence that you give now. I mean, do I understand you now to be saying that you accept that you phoned him around about this time?
I do not accept that. I'm saying
Well, what were you saying?
I cannot recall that I called him. I do not deny that I may have placed a physical call
And why
in
would,
the
you have,
engineering
why would you have done that around this
because I
time?
know him.
Yes, well, that's the point.
Because I know him, not because I intended to pressure him, Mr. Maybe.
Mr. Mahlangu, let us just deal with this, because of course this is not something you deal with in your affidavit.
So, I'm sorry, so your point is your point, you may have called him, but the purpose would have been different.
That is correct, Chair.
If you called him, you would have wanted to talk about something else.
We either spoke, that's why I'm saying, because I knew him, it's difficult for me to deny that there could have been a phone call during that period. Particularly, Chair, he was in the space that I knew, that he knew better than I was, and I was new at the time. But I wouldn't pick up the call for the purposes of pressurizing him.
Could you have picked up the call to persuade him?
No, I was not, like I said, Chair, my view of the matter was clinical. This thing could be dealt with. There was no urgency for me.
So you accept then that you may, during the course of February, have placed a telephonic call to Mr. Mpoma.
That's correct.
Why did you not say that in your affidavit?
The critical thing I dealt with in my affidavit was, I understood, and this is my understanding, was that I pressured him.
So can we then deal with, assuming you had made this call, because Mr. Mpoma says there was one, around about this time in February, what is it that you would have discussed with him?
I do not know, Mr. Maybeck. I do not know.
You don't know. Can you not even think about what you might have discussed with him?
Mr. Maybeck, I do not know. What I'm saying to you is that I knew the man. There were many things we could have spoken about. I could have sourced advice about things happening at Transnet. I could have sourced things, but I did not call him to pressurize him, because pressurizing him is a specific event.
So what typically, because I didn't know these facts before, that you seemingly would regularly speak to Mr. Mpoma on the phone. What typically then would you discuss with him?
Mr. Maybeck, I'm unable to recall the issues, but like I said to you, we're in the same social circle. He was at Transnet. I'm new in the SOE environment. I could have asked for advice. I could have been discussing the happenings at the time, right? But I would not have pressured him.
You see,
That's my evidence is that I did not pressure Mr. Mapoma.
you see, Mr. Mahlangu, you really now add something to my list on the probabilities, because you did phone him. You don't deny that there could have been a discussion.
I did not say I phoned him. I said because of the nature of my relations with
Yes.
Mr. Mapoma, it is possible that I may have phoned him, Chair.
But what you're saying is that insofar as Mr. Mpoma says, one, there was a telephone call, I can't dispute that, because I might ordinarily phone him.
That is correct.
Yeah. And it's very important what you say, because you were new on the block, right? Here was someone inside Transnet that you knew well, correct?
Yes.
Well, I think I've already made my points to you. I just want to ask you once more. What is it that you would typically speak to Mr. Mpoma about when you placed these calls to him?
Chair, I've answered this question.
What's the answer?
Maybe let me put it this way. You did say you had regular interactions with Mr. Mkhwanazi, is that right?
That is correct.
Yes. Did you also have regular interactions with Mr. Mapoma?
Not to my recollection, Chair. It's not regular, but it's not unusual for a call to have happened.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, whenever you had interactions with him by way of phone calls, what type of issues would you have discussed with him during that time, generally speaking?
Chair, and I'm just saying this, trying to reconstruct. I think that I would have sought certain insights on things that would have either been happening at Transnet or in the SOC environment in general. And that probably would then dovetail to whatever other social discussion there could have been at the time.
Okay.
Yes, well, I mean, then you make really the very point I'm driving at. It would have been about insights. Here, the common issue between you and Mr. Mpoma was Mr. Gama. Both of you were dealing with that, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. All the more reason then why you would have had the discussion that he describes.
That is impossible. It's impossible, Chair.
Then
I stand here today pained to try to remember, to try to say why. I've spoken to some of the people I knew who also know him, who are senior, and I was like, this for me is bizarre. And Mr. Maybeck, it really pains me, because I don't know.
All right. Well,
We are at 8 minutes past
I've got only one more question,
Oh, okay, all
Chairperson,
right.
if I may. I mean, it might lead to one or two others, but it
Yes.
won't take
No,
long.
no, that's fine. I just wanted to have an idea that I wanted us to be on the same page.
Certainly.
I mean, for purposes of finishing, I don't mind if we go up to 1:30, if
All right.
everybody is fine with that, rather than adjourn for lunch and come back.
Yes, thank you.
Would that be fine with you?
That's fine with me, Chair.
Okay, all right.
So what I then want to ask you, and I mean, I suppose there's a shortcut way of dealing with this. Did you listen to the evidence of Mr. Mkhwanazi?
I listened to the evidence of Mr. Mkhwanazi, yes, on Monday.
Yeah, and I'm just going to ask you this, and if you can comment, you can comment. But certainly on an analysis of the evidence that was led by Mr. Mkhwanazi, it is certainly arguable that the only rational basis for the reinstatement of Mr. Gama on the terms that he was reinstated is that there must have been an instruction, a political instruction, because otherwise it makes absolutely no sense.
Chair, I can't comment on it.
Because that,
Well, maybe one can ask this, and maybe your answer that you can't comment includes this, but I just want to make sure. You have had a chance to look at that settlement, at the terms of that settlement agreement, haven't you?
I have, Chair.
Yes. I asked Mr. Mkwanazi when he gave evidence here what he would say if somebody said it was indefensible. The reinstatement of Mr. Gama was indefensible in the light of everything that he said, and he conceded that it was indefensible. Would you share that, or is that something you prefer not to comment on?
I'll leave that to the Board of Transnet, Chair.
Yes. Okay, all right. You see, okay, maybe let me allow Mr. Mybeck to finish his questions.
that's
first.
really the only question that I had.
Yes. You see, Mr. When one looks at that settlement agreement, and I would have expected you as an experienced lawyer to have a view about whether it's on the face of it. I mean, you might not know all the facts, but on the face of it, whether it seems, it doesn't seem very strange. But when you look at it, you say to yourself, but why would the Board of Transnet conclude a settlement agreement on these terms, particularly when you have read the judgment in quotes or rulings of the chairperson of the Dismissal inquiry. And of course, there is also a report or opinion by Mr. Todd from Bowman Gilflins, who was Transnet's attorney in regard to the Gama matter until his mandate was terminated sometime, I think, in January. And Transnet, the board took the matter to Dene's rates. One of the things they do is they undertake to pay Mr. Gama's 75% of Mr. Gama's costs in relation to a High Court application that he had brought before his disciplinary inquiry, where he sought to interdict the disciplinary inquiry, and he lost, and the High Court ordered him to pay Transnet's costs. Now, that was a matter that had been finalized. He applied for leave to appeal, that was refused. That matter was finalized. The High Court had ordered costs in favor of Transnet. When they settle the dismissal matter, they say, instead of enforcing the High Court cost order in their favor against Mr. Gama, they instruct Mr. Todd, who had gone a long way to try and recover those costs. That's about 426,000 rand. They instruct him to stop that. And instead, they say, Mr. Gama, we will pay 75% of your costs. Now, I don't know about you, but throughout my experience in law, I've never heard of anything like that, of a party who has been ordered by a court to pay my costs. I say, no, don't worry, I will pay 75% of your costs. It's something that's unthinkable. And then they say he must, they'll give him a final written warning. But they say the final written warning will be deemed to have started running from the day he was dismissed for 6 months. And 6 months ended in December 2010. They are signing the settlement agreement in February 2011. So it's ineffective. You say, what were they thinking? How can you give a written warning that won't be applicable when the person comes back? Then they say, okay, in relation to the unfair dismissal claim, we will also pay 75% of Mr. Gama's costs. Now, I don't know how much labor matters you know, but Mr. Mybeck here and Mr. Todd, deal a lot with labor matters. In labor matters, in the bargaining councils, CCMA and Labor Court, it's not easy for the losing party to be ordered to pay costs for the winning party. It's something very rare. And here, this is what the Transnet board undertook to do. In circumstances where Mr. Gama had been given a very fair disciplinary process, in circumstances where he had been found guilty of 3 very serious acts of misconduct, in circumstances where at that time the board knew that he accepted that he had been properly found guilty of those. He was no longer disputing them. Then you ask yourself the question, under what circumstances could the board have ever thought they were at risk of being ordered by the bargaining council to pay 100% of his costs? Because that's the only thinking one can think of, to say, well, maybe they thought, well, let's offer to pay 75% so that because we're at risk of being ordered to pay 100%. You don't understand all of those things. That's apart from other things. Those are just some of the things. But you might not be able to say anything.
Chair, I would only express a view like yours.
Yes.
Because I don't know what the board...
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so, but the point I wanted to make is that when you have a settlement agreement like that, you look for a reason why the employer would settle on those terms, which are very much in favor of the employee and against the employer. And you look at the merits of the case, you find that the employer had a very strong case. So it can't be, so you say it doesn't look like it can be the merits of the case that drove them to agree to these terms. So what is it? You start looking, okay? And then of course, Mr. Mkwanazi says, at the first meeting I had with Minister Gigaba, where he offered me the position of chair of the board, which I subsequently accepted. One of the issues he raised up front was the issue of Mr. Gama's dismissal. And Mr. Mkwanazi said, Minister Gigaba expressed the view that Mr. Gigaba's dismissal had been unfair, and instructed him and the board to review the matter. That's what happens. And then, of course, Mr. Mapoma gives the evidence that he gave, including that you called him, pressured him. And then, in the context of all of this, one has to go back to the evidence of Ms. Barbara Hogan, which Mr. Mybeck outlined earlier on. Ms. Barbara Hogan said that the then President, Mr. Zuma, when she told him that the board had recommended Mr. Sipho Masego for the position of Group CEO for Transnet, responded by saying he had only one choice, and his choice for that position was Mr. Gama. Mr. Zuma has denied having said that. But in the end, if the finding were to be that Ms. Hogan's evidence is true, then one would then look at what happened after, and one looks at this kind of mysterious reinstatement of Mr. Gama, and actually about within 3 years after that, after he has been reinstated to this position, he actually becomes Group CEO of Transnet. So one can't divorce a consideration of the issues from all of this. So I thought I would just mention that to you to say, you know, there are all these aspects that have to be looked into.
I agree, Chair. Chair, I think that you've asked the right question about, for me, as you were going through it, my question was, in a settlement, you want to know what the other party gave and what you're buying. And those are determinations which I think were made by the board. So I'm also reading it clinically. From a lawyer's perspective, it's a bit curious. But I don't know if there were commercial considerations which must be brought before you by the board. And the reason why I don't want to comment deeply on it is because the board at the time had eminent persons in it with very serious experience in running big corporates, including listed companies. So that's why I want to defer that to them.
Yes.
But insofar as my party is concerned, Chair, I've said what I've said, and I think, Chair, I can't take it further than the fact that I was not an automaton. I exercised my judgment as I saw it. I gave advice, and when necessary, I would just let the system work.
Yeah. Okay, no, thank you.
We have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maybeck, and
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahlangu, for coming to assist the Commission. I think probably you will still come back because of the other matters, but thank you very much for coming to assist the Commission.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Maybeck.
You are excused. So we'll adjourn for the day,
Thank you, Chairperson.
and just for the public, next week, the Commission will hear evidence relating to the NEL. We adjourn.
All rise.